At the heart of England's capital stands the Tower of London, a symbol of power for nearly 1,000 years. Through its long history, the tower has been the castle of kings, a fortress, a stronghold of royal treasure, a forbidding prison. Its stones have witnessed mysteries, tortures, executions. These tower walls have tales to tell. Today, the tower is one of the world's most popular tourist spots. The famous guards of the tower, the Beefeaters, guide sightseers through the benign castle. But in the past, reluctant visitors found the fortress full of horrific danger. After the Normans conquered England, they built the Tower of London as their centre of rule over the kingdom. Long before Buckingham Palace, the tower was the symbol of royal might. To control the tower was to control England, and anyone who violated the secure centre of power paid a heavy price. The tower exacted brutal revenge for those who challenged its cold walls. But the tower saved its most severe punishment for those who worked in the fortress and dared betray it. This was the case for a naive, love-struck prison guard who ended up gruesomely hung to die from a tower wall. His partners in crime were two thieves who faced death in an ingenious, horrifying execution. Together they were involved in a twisted romantic triangle that started with a bold robbery of the king's gold. In 1531, a shipment of 366 gold crowns belonging to King Henry VIII arrived at the London docks. With a modern value of over $1 million, it was a virtual king's ransom. But the gold was mysteriously stolen. The brazen robbery of the king's gold launched a massive investigation. 2 years later, a shady sailor was arrested and imprisoned in the tower as authorities prepared their case against him. While the sailor languished in the dark confines of the tower, he was often visited by his common-law wife, Alice Tankerville. During Alice's visits, a young prison guard named John Board was smitten with the beautiful and seductive Alice. John Board's infatuation with Alice started innocently enough, but in the end, it would cost the naive jailer dearly. The trouble started when Alice's husband was released for lack of evidence. Knowing he had to leave London and hide out, Alice's husband asked Board to look after Alice. Already hopelessly in love with Alice, the prison guard happily agreed. Spending more and more time with Board, Alice began returning the prison guard's affection. Before long, they fell into a passionate love affair. Alice became a familiar face around the tower as she frequently visited Board to consummate heated couplings. But the romance was to have tragic consequences. New evidence surfaced in the theft of the king's gold. Not only had Alice's husband stolen the gold, but Alice herself was also clearly guilty in the heist. Alice and her husband were tried in secret. They were convicted and sentenced to be executed. Alice's husband was nowhere to be found, but finding Alice was easy. On one of her visits to her lover, John Board, she was arrested and thrown into a windowless cell in the tower. Borde had to endure seeing Alice's harsh imprisonment. Wasting away in a small, dark cell, Alice awaited her execution. Frightened for his Alice, the lovesick John Borde schemed an assignment to serve as her guard. Separated by a heavy cell door, the jailer and the prisoner he loved spent long hours together. Seeing no way out, the desperate sweethearts plotted a daring escape. John Borde had crossed a dangerous line. He abandoned his duty to the crown and gave his heart to a criminal, the woman he loved. John Borde was attempting the impossible. Even though he was a jailer, the tower was considered to be inescapable. The couple launched a risky plan. Borde made a copy of the key to the outer door of Alice's cell block. He also bought a 60-foot-long length of rope. Borde smuggled the rope to Alice for safekeeping. He also passed her a small stick of wood. She hid the tools of escape in a shadowy corner of her cell. Next, they waited for a moonless night. Within the week, a night came. The two lovers went into action. As Borde went off duty, Alice passed him the rope. He passed her the duplicate key. After the head warden made his final routine check and locked the outer door, Alice was ready. Using the stick Borde had given her, she pushed the wooden pin out of the latch. In seconds, she was out of the cell. Using the duplicate key, Alice opened the cell block door and stepped into the hallways of the tower. Hiding under a dark cloak, Alice slipped outside and into the darkness of the fortress. Carefully, she worked her way along and into the waiting arms of her lover. Holding their breath, Alice and Borde waited for the night watchman to pass on his regular rounds. Alice and Borde lowered the rope over the wall and into a small boat anchored in the moat far below. They slid down the rope and into the boat. Then they edged out across the moat under the eyes of the guards. In the spring night, they glided silently to the opposite side of the bank. Borde had arranged for a pair of horses to be waiting nearby. They would ride to a friend's house. From there, the lovers would make their final dash for freedom. Just within yards of their getaway, they came face to face with the night watch. In a cold sweat, Alice and Borde approached the oncoming soldiers. They desperately hoped they could get away with a quick greeting, but it was too late. The soldiers challenged them. In seconds, all hope of escape vanished. They would face the vengeance of the tower. Alice was taken to the same miserable cell that had been her home for 7 long months. This time, the door was securely locked. But something much worse awaited John Borde, the jailer who had gone over to the other side. Enraged by the treason of their own jail guard, the authorities had a simple torture for Borde. They stuffed him into the notorious cell known as Little Ease. The cell was neither wide enough to lie down in, nor tall enough to stand up in. Borde was forced to be in a crouching position day and night. The pain was agonizing. After an extensive manhunt, the authorities caught up with Alice's husband. He was hauled to the tower to await execution. When Alice was reunited with her husband, fate had one more twist in store as the couple ended up spending their last moments together. On March the 31st, 1534, Alice and her sometimes husband faced a hellishly ingenious death for stealing the king's gold. The couple were taken to the bottom of the tower wall at the edge of the River Thames. At low tide, they were chained to the wall, waist deep in the water. Terrified, Alice and her husband watched as the rising tide slowly lifted. They twisted and turned in panic as the water came closer and closer, drowning them slowly. Alice and her husband died horrible deaths, but John Borde's fate was worse. There was no limit to the price to be paid for betrayal of a trusted position in the tower. Borde was tortured on the rack, while other guards cruelly jeered him. The rack's usual purpose was to extract confessions, but in this case, it was cruelly used to inflict horrendous pain. After the rack, Borde's muscles were torn. His arms and legs were pulled from their sockets, but the disgraced prison guard's ordeal had just begun. Borde was then chained and suspended from a wall of the tower. He hung for days, slowly dying of exposure and starvation. His body was left to rot, a gruesome example to anyone foolish enough to defy the awful justice of the tower. Through the centuries, many have tried to breach the tower's security. Only one man ever succeeded in actually invading the Tower of London. He led a murderous mob into the very heart of the kingdom. But the tower got its revenge. The 14th century was a desolate era. Horror and fear paralyzed Britain as the bubonic plague stalked the land. It was known as the Black Death. The disease was fatal in almost all cases. Those infected faced an agonizing death. The disease was carried by rats and passed to humans through fleas. Science and medicine did not exist in the Dark Ages. Ignorance bred panic. Those still healthy shunned the dying. In a misguided attempt to keep the plague from spreading, soldiers sealed up houses and all those inside. Even if just one member of a family fell ill, a black cross was painted on the door, and no one was allowed to help. In order to purify the area, the house would be burnt to the ground. Even healthy people trapped inside would be burned alive. Medical solutions to cure the plague were often as bad as the disease itself. The most common remedy was to attach live leeches to the patient to suck poisons out of the blood. If the leeches didn't appear to work, the patient would be bled directly, supposedly to release poisoned blood. Unfortunately, patients often bled to death. Some physicians had a theory the Black Death was caused by demons in the mind. They saw only one way to release the demons. Patients had holes drilled into their head. Surgical instruments were rare, so the tools used by physicians were usually borrowed from a carpenter or a mason. No one was cured, and few survived. In an atmosphere of panic and superstition, turning to the church for an explanation of the Black Death brought little comfort. Priests claimed God was punishing men for their sins. In the end, the Black Death killed almost half Britain's population. The survivors faced a living hell. Famine stalked the land as people ate dogs, horses, and garbage. Cities were abandoned. It was a time of anarchy. In an era of chaos, Even the tower that stood impenetrable to enemies for centuries was breached for the first and only time in its history. An ex-soldier who made his living as a thief and highwayman led a howling mob that successfully stormed the tower and rampaged through the royal household. Only a frail teenage boy stood between the raging mob and the chaotic collapse of the kingdom. The future of England was in his hands. The boy, 14-year-old King Richard II, sat on the throne of England. Because of his youth, the kingdom was run by a royal council. The advisors governed the country on Richard's behalf until he matured. To add to the burden of plague, famine and poverty, many people who worked the land were serfs, feudal slaves controlled by the nobles. The council of aloof, rich noblemen had no connection with the common people. When the council insisted on collecting heavy taxes in 1380, the peasants broke into open revolt.
Enough of the king! No!
Escaping oppression, thousands of starving, homeless peasants wandered England's roads. But in the taverns of London, one man was ready to exploit the peasants' anger. A former soldier and highwayman, Wat Tyler, fueled their anxieties. The disgruntled peasants eagerly listened to him. Tyler emerged as a leader to command the dispossessed mob. News of the angry mob reached the tower. King Richard decided the time had come to put away his childish pursuits. The teenage Richard interrupted his advisors. The boy king wanted to personally talk to the peasants. Over objections from the council, Richard insisted on meeting with Tyler's mob before they reached London. But the meeting was a disaster. The youthful Richard desperately tried to reason with Tyler and his angry men. The teenage king's pleas were drowned out by the raging mob.
Yeah, what are you doing, eh?
I promise you your freedom.
The unruly crowd began moving towards the king. Beating a hasty retreat, Richard was hustled back to London and the safety of the tower.
I have no proof with me.
Is that all you can say? Is that all you can say? Pretty much. What are you going to do for us?
But Wat Tyler and the rebels hounded Richard and the royal court back to the city. Reaching London, the mob surged through the narrow streets, pillaging everything in their path. Desperate to save their lives and property, Londoners offered the mob food, beer and wine. But alcohol just fired up the mob. They became uncontrollable. Rioting continued into the night. Hundreds died in an orgy of looting, murder and destruction. Moving from the streets of London, Tyler led the baying mob to the tower. From the parapets of the tower, young Richard watched helplessly as Tyler and the horde surrounded the tower. It looked as if the entire kingdom was about to be plunged into chaos. An angry horde of peasants outnumbered soldiers 50-1. The council told Richard to attack the mob. Under immense pressure, the 14-year-old king was maturing into a wise ruler. He vetoed the advice to assault the crowd. Instead, the young king addressed the crowd from the tower roof and offered a solution. If they would leave, he would hear their grievances the next day at a nearby field. Tens of thousands agreed to the meeting. The next morning, Richard and the royal party rode out to meet the mob. There was danger in the air as the teenage king confronted Tyler and the peasant mob at the field. The young king agreed to cancel the tax, and he abolished serfdom. From now on, serfs would become tenant farmers, free to choose where they worked. While the young king tirelessly worked to solve the peasants' grievances, Tyler crept back to London, where thousands of his followers still surrounded the tower. Convinced he could seize the royal stronghold and command the city, Tyler whipped his men into a fury. He boasted the mob would rule all of England by the end of the week. Rushing the tower, the mob overwhelmed the guard, seized the outer drawbridge, and stormed the main gate. Tyler had accomplished the impossible. For the first and only time in history, the Tower of London had been breached by an enemy force. They surged through the halls and passageways, destroying everything in their path. Breaking into the king's private quarters, the mob attacked Richard's mother and raped her lady-in-waiting. When they reached the royal chapel, the mob found the Archbishop of Canterbury giving communion to the Lord Treasurer and the royal physician. They knocked the communion cup from the Archbishop's hand and stabbed all three to death. Unaware of the attack, Richard returned to find the tower in ruins. He didn't know if his mother was alive or dead. Richard had attempted a peaceful end to the crisis, but it seemed doomed to failure. Despite the personal attack on his family, the young king was determined not to fight violence with violence. Taking the future of the kingdom in his hands, risking his own life, Richard arranged a final showdown with Tyler. Accompanied by a bodyguard of armoured knights and London's Lord Mayor, the boy king bravely faced Wat Tyler and his unruly mob. Richard was hugely outnumbered. The swaggering Tyler rode up to the king. Tyler recited a list of demands. All nobles except the king were to be abolished. Bishops would be stripped of their power. All church property would be handed over to the rebels to be divided amongst themselves. But Tyler went too far when he demanded the king's great sword of state. Told it was the king's sword and he was not fit to hold it, the enraged Tyler pulled a dagger to attack Richard. Suddenly, the Lord Mayor threw his body in front of Tyler to protect the king. Furious, Tyler plunged his dagger into the Lord Mayor's stomach, but the blade harmlessly glanced off the mayor's armor. Before Tyler realized what had happened, the Lord Mayor drew his dagger and gored Tyler across the neck. Blood gushing from the wound, Tyler screamed in pain and stumbled to the ground. With their leader dying, the mob surged forward. Ready to fight, they drew swords and loaded arrows. The king's bodyguards prepared for battle. The outnumbered Richard was about to be overrun. But the teenage king calmly rode forward and addressed the mob.
Sirs, will you kill your king? I am your rightful leader. If you love me, follow me.
With that, Richard turned his horse around away from London. The leaderless peasants quietly gathered up their weapons and followed Richard. They broke up and began to make their way home. 14-year-old Richard had proven he was more a king than a boy. And Wat Tyler, the only man to lead a successful assault on the tower, was dead. In its greatest moment of danger, the tower had remained in its rightful hands. The assault on the tower had been avenged. The walls of the tower are cold and inanimate, but through the centuries, the fortress seemed to know how to dispense terrible justice. In the 17th century, the tower made sure justice was done, when a judge who condemned many to an unfair death faced his own miserable end in a tower cell. In 1690, a member of the English Parliament opened his door one morning to find a grim sight. A corpse had been nailed to his door as a warning. The gruesome message came from Judge George Jeffreys. The judge was in charge of administration of justice during the short, turbulent reign of King James II.
Take the rabble away!
An unpopular king, James was arrogant and held a contempt for the law. The king brooked no criticism of himself or his Catholic faith. To carry out his authoritarian policies, James needed a strong enforcer who didn't mind if the law got in the way. Often drunk in court, Jeffreys had a reputation as an abusive jurist who matched the king's disregard for the law. Seeing a kindred spirit, James appointed Judge Jeffreys as a high state official. Next to the king, Jeffreys was the most powerful man in England. Jeffreys revelled in his new power and hijacked the legal system. In a kingdom ruled by law, Jeffreys now became the law himself. He used the legal bench to condemn anyone foolish enough to voice even the mildest complaint about King James or the Catholic Church. He draped the walls of his kangaroo court in blood-red tapestries to terrify anyone brought before him. A mean drunk, Jeffreys had no time for legal niceties. The only accepted plea in his lawless court was guilty.
Take him away!
A not guilty plea took up too much time and was likely to get the accused hanged on the spot without even having time to say their prayers before the execution. The English chafed under the autocratic rule of King James and his henchman Judge Jeffreys.
There's no such plea as not guilty in my court.
With every new execution, opposition to King James and Judge Jeffreys grew. The king's enemies grew bolder and searched for someone to replace him. The king's enemies finally turned to King James's nephew, the Duke of Monmouth. As the illegitimate son of the late King Charles, Monmouth had royal blood. He was also a Protestant, which would bring religious peace. Handsome and charming, Monmouth had been a brave and popular army leader by the age of 20. And Monmouth hated his uncle the king. Driven more by ambition than sense, Monmouth seized the offer to unseat the king. With the help of the king's enemies, Monmouth raised an army to overthrow his uncle. He was ready to ride into the Tower of London in victory. Despite his best efforts to raise support, Monmouth's cause fell apart. The handsome young duke ran for his life.
85.
With Monmouth defeated, Judge Jeffreys charged him with high treason, waging war against the king and trying to assume the crown. To make his point, Jeffreys added his own personal postscript.
Monmouth, may you rot in hell.
2 days later, Monmouth was captured. Ignoring legal procedure, Jeffreys ruled Monmouth was not entitled to a trial and immediately sentenced him to a beheading. A crowd of Monmouth's supporters gathered on Tower Hill to watch his grisly end. With solemn dignity, Monmouth walked through the throng and mounted the black draped scaffold. Before kneeling to the block, Monmouth calmly felt the edge of the executioner's axe. He wondered if the blade was sharp enough to sever his neck. As was the morbid custom of the times, Monmouth tipped the executioner 6 coins to do a quick, clean job. With what followed, the gratuity was undeserved. Unnerved by Monmouth's calm, the executioner missed with the first stroke. The blade only grazed the back of Monmouth's head. The executioner tried again. The crowd screamed and pushed towards the scaffold. Their hero Monmouth was being butchered like a hog. Frustrated, the executioner tossed his axe aside. Putting an end to the sloppy execution, he pulled a knife and stabbed Monmouth to death. The enraged mob rushed the scaffold, pulling the executioner and several guards to the ground. The scene exploded into chaos as others dipped handkerchiefs in Monmouth's blood to keep as souvenirs of their hero. Where he failed to bring Jeffreys down in life, Monmouth would succeed in death.
Our
The botched execution fanned popular discontent. Fearing a general rebellion, King James and Judge Jeffreys quickly and ruthlessly moved to stamp out resistance. Jeffreys' spies rooted out Monmouth's conspirators and supporters. Drinking heavily in court, the judge pursued his brand of justice with renewed zeal. In 2 months, Judge Jeffreys had over 320 men and women executed.
And each of you will be hung.
Another 841 people were sent to the West Indies to be sold as slaves. Jeffreys bragged he'd hanged more men than all his predecessors since the Norman conquest. Judge Jeffreys' lawless rampage was out of control. Members of the House of Lords finally objected to his brutality. A law unto himself, Jeffreys answered the legislators by nailing corpses to their front doors. Supporting Jeffreys, King James suspended the legal system and disbanded Parliament. Public outrage at King James and Judge Jeffreys now reached a breaking point. There was only one way to end the mayhem. With nowhere to turn, Parliament reached out to a foreign power to help overthrow the tyrants. In desperation, Parliament urged the Protestant King of Holland to invade England and claim the throne for himself. James fled his capital after barely 3 years on the throne. With his protector gone, the tyrannical Judge Jeffreys ran for his life. Disguised as a sailor, he snuck off to the London docks. He bought passage to France on a coal barge. He was about to avoid true justice. But while Jeffreys waited for the boat to sail, he wanted one more drink. He crept ashore and went to a dockside tavern named the Red Crow. It would prove to be a costly drink. As Jeffreys drank, he was recognized by a clerk. Jeffreys had once sentenced the man to a whipping.
Hey, Thurston, Summershine, Jack. This is Jeffreys.
The judge was exposed. He huddled in a corner, desperately ducking drinks, food and insults hurled by the rabid crowd. Authorities were summoned to save Jeffreys from the mob and haul him away. Ironically, the terrified Jeffreys begged to be taken to the safest place in the city, the Tower of London. But even the thick walls of the tower could not protect Jeffreys from public hatred. Jeffreys' victims were let into the tower to stare at their judge through his cell bars. Caged like an animal, Jeffreys had to endure the abuse hurled at him. Knowing he was a drunk, Parliament instructed the guards at the tower to provide Jeffreys with all the brandy he could pay for. It turned out to be a suitable punishment. Four months later, abandoned and alone, Judge Jeffreys literally drank himself to death. The Tower of London always seemed to visit revenge on those who worked within its walls and abused their power. No one had more control over the tower than the man who kept the keys to the fortress. And when he turned traitor, the tower unleashed its terrible vengeance once again. In 1147, a man with an arrow in his skull lay on a field writhing in agony. It was the price he was paying for treachery and lust for power. The man was Geoffrey de Mandeville, the Tower's constable and the Sheriff of London. The Tower Constable was one of the kingdom's most respected officers, for he held the keys to the castle. Control of the tower was crucial in the 12th century. with England under the harsh but shaky rule of the Norman kings, holding the central military position in London meant control of all England. But chaos descended on the Tower when King Henry I died and left no heir to take the throne. As the king's daughter, Matilda was the obvious choice to succeed to the throne. Hard and cynical, she was suited for the job. But a woman had never served as a monarch of England. The one other candidate with royal blood was Matilda's enemy and cousin, Count Stephen of Blois. Stephen was the dead king's favourite nephew. He was friendly, attractive, and good-natured, but many considered him too soft to be king. Which cousin would rule over England? Into the confusion stepped Mandeville. An opportunist, he saw his crucial position of the Tower Guardian as a way to gain power. When Stephen made the first move and grabbed the contested throne by taking over the tower, Mandeville was at the gate to meet him. Eager to ingratiate himself with the new king, Mandeville presented Stephen with the keys to the fortress. Then Mandeville started a shameless campaign to curry favour from the king. Stephen also needed toadies like Mandeville. With his cousin Matilda eyeing the throne, the new king was on shaky ground. To keep Mandeville and other noblemen on his side, Stephen gave them land, castles, and estates. Mandeville and the other noblemen were willing to sell their loyalty to the highest bidder. They played Stephen off against his cousin Matilda in the battle for the throne. As the barons gained one concession after another, Stephen began to lose control. Meanwhile, Matilda made her move. She made lavish offers of land and money to any nobleman who would help her overthrow her cousin Stephen. Mandeville was the first in line. The war between the cousins, King Stephen and Matilda, for the throne of England was about to begin. The treacherous Mandeville, who had supported King Stephen, switched sides. He was waiting on the beach to welcome Matilda when she landed in England to begin the battle over the crown. Soon, England tore itself apart in bloody civil war. Towns, villages and farms were burnt and looted by one side, then the other. Many starved to death in the famine that followed, their bodies left in heaps. As the powerful battled, the poor suffered sorrow, misery and oppression. After Stephen was captured, his cousin Matilda's army fought on. Behaving like the cynical politician he was, Mandeville greeted Matilda when she marched into London. He greeted her as warmly as he'd greeted her cousin Stephen only 6 years earlier. Mandeville eagerly offered her the keys to the Tower of London.
The keys to the city.
Now that Matilda controlled the Tower and most of the country, it wasn't long before the war-weary English had reason to hate her.
How dare you come to me with these pathetic excuses?
She imposed crushing taxes on the impoverished country and ordered troops to ruthlessly put down any sign of insurrection. For failing to pay Matilda's taxes, 3 villagers from Suffolk were impaled on wooden spikes. As an object lesson to the population, they suffered in full view of everyone on the main road. There they agonizingly died of exposure and loss of blood. Even Mandeville was shocked by Matilda's behavior. As Matilda planned her coronation, her support crumbled away. The calculating Matilda had also made another grave mistake. She left her cousin Stephen alive, albeit as a prisoner in the tower. Once again, Mandeville had to work out which way to jump and which side to support. Stephen's army reached London, and townspeople broke into open revolt against the tyrannical Matilda. As the gates of the city were thrown open to Stephen's army, Matilda and Mandeville slipped out in the confusion, fleeing for their lives. Many of the noblemen who had supported Matilda switched sides back again to King Stephen. Mandeville wasn't so lucky. With the country in chaos, Mandeville was captured by Stephen and stripped of his land and titles and arrested for treason. After holding the keys to the tower, he was now kept in one of the tower cells. But once again, Mandeville was able to play both sides against the middle.
Well.
Mandeville begged King Stephen's forgiveness. He surrendered his castles to the king and gave his word of honor never to plot against him again. Needing Mandeville's support, Stephen forgave him and released him from prison.
Seems you have nowhere else to go now.
My liege, my liege.
You betray me again. Not anywhere to stay. Nowhere to hide. No roof, no shelter. Not in this country or anywhere in Europe. I'll hunt you down. All right?
Stripped of his power, title and wealth, Mandeville had nothing to lose.
Now go. Get out of my sight.
Go now. Be gone. Get out!
To get it all back, Mandeville launched a vicious war against Stephen. At the head of his personal army, Mandeville attacked the king's castles and land. He cut a swathe of devastation, destroying towns and villages loyal to the king. He burned houses, seized crops and farm animals, robbed churches. Anyone who got in his way was slaughtered. Villagers were expected to pay taxes to keep his personal army in the field. If they refused, retribution was immediate. Wives were widowed and children were orphaned as his cruelty ran unchecked. Pursuing his guerrilla war, Mandeville moved against one of Stephen's castles. As the army approached the fortress, Mandeville rode ahead to survey the defences. Then he removed his helmet for a better look. A crossbowman on the castle wall took careful aim and fired an arrow straight into Mandeville's head. With the arrow buried deep in his skull, Mandeville lived in agony for almost a week. Finally, the scheming opportunist died with nothing to show for his efforts. Like so many before and after him, Mandeville realized the tower leveled its own special vengeance. To challenge the tower was often foolhardy, but to fail was fatal. Across the centuries, the tower has been the symbol of royal power. Its stones have guarded one of the largest empires in history. But such immense power exacts its price. Those who could not rise the challenge of gaining and holding power had their spirits and bodies crushed within the tower walls.